Okay, hello everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us today for a discussion on carving a modern engineering organization from an enterprise. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Slack. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Creating Culture channel. We may also have time to answer a couple of questions live, so please do submit those through the Q&A function and we'll get to them if we can towards the end. So first of all, let's get started with some introductions. I'll go first. My name's Rich Dixon, and today I'll be joined by 4 great tech leaders to share their experience and insights. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Blanca, would you mind going first, please?
Sure, Rich. So my name is Blanca Garcia Gil. I work as a principal systems engineer at the BBC on the Big Data Platform team. For the last year, I have been focusing on kind of leading up one of our squads within our bigger team on basically the performance of our data warehouse. And it's kind of goes more than SQL, just kind of analyzing SQL queries. There's like a broader kind of business need that we've been addressing. I have been at the BBC for 5 years. But prior to that, I spent about 10 years in small and medium enterprises. So I am super excited to be here today because when I joined the BBC, there were lots of opportunities, but lots of other things I didn't know that working at a big enterprise would bring. And in order to maximize my impact within the organization, it has been key for me to kind of learn about those things and kind of learn how to use the tools available.
Brilliant, thank you. Dilip, can I come to you next, please?
Sure, Rich. Dilip Marway. I work for The Economist and I'm head of quality assurance. And I look after our enablement team, which essentially is our DevSecOps team. Just a bit about myself. So I've been growing our engineering practice and QA practice in Birmingham. I've been there for just over 3 years and I've got over 15 years experience in quality assurance and also software development. I'm very passionate about quality. It's what I've been doing all my life. Very passionate about people. I'm just really happy to be here to talk with some great people. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you very much. Bree, over to you.
Hey, Aubrey Stern, also hailing from Birmingham at the moment. An interim CTO by trade, generalist of everything and a mistress of absolutely nothing whatsoever. I'm a big fan of working really, really fast and working in production. And I also work in a lot of regulated environments. So those things don't normally go hand in hand. And I spent an awful lot of time looking at the things that create and kill agility in these large organizations that are heavily regulated and heavily wrapped in controls. And that's been my focus for the last couple of years. At the moment, I work for nobody whatsoever apart from myself, and I'm in the middle of building a startup to look at those things and to look at how we can create agility in controlled and regulated environments.
And we were just talking about the startup idea before we joined the call, and I think I'm investing already. Steve, can I come over to you next, please?
Sure. Well, I guess I can continue the theme of startups. So, Aubrey, if you want to chat about startups, it's certainly an area that I've been involved with. I started a company way back in Wales in the UK after a career of IT actually in the NHS for a little bit, but it's a slight strange to go from NHS to entrepreneurship. But I built a workflow company which I sold actually to Salesforce.com, which brought me over here to California, and then I built another workflow business and I sold that to Dell a few years ago, and then I became chief product officer of a company called Dell Boomi, and then now recently I head up platform at Slack. So I'm a product person, but I've worn many hats across engineering, startup, and technology leadership. So yeah, excited to have a chat today.
Brilliant, thanks everyone. Just to introduce myself as well, so I'm Rich Dixon from the engineering team at Legal & General, which is a financial services company in the UK. I've spent most of my career building engineering teams in lots of different industries. So I worked at AOL in my early days when it was when half the CDs in the world were AOL printed. Vodafone, New Look, in the fast fashion retail, e-commerce retail in the UK. And now at L&G, we've spent 5 years or so growing the in-house engineering team from a standing start. So focusing on agile and DevOps culture and approaches, principally for our digital applications and cloud journey, and now starting to look more widely across the business as a whole. So again, really excited to be here and hear the combined expertise of all of you guys. So thank you ever so much to you and the people on the call for joining. So why are we here today? Well, it's a great time to be in this industry right now. Everyone knows that software engineers are in demand, and because of that, companies old and new are bending over backwards to provide their engineering team with the best perks, the best working standards, cultures, and so on. For some companies, this is easier than others. There's a whole new breed of tech companies for whom engineering is the core around which the rest of the company is built. But what about enterprise organizations? For traditional companies, engineering is the new department on the rise, and the pre-existing culture and processes may be far more ingrained. So today we'll discuss some ways to help engineering leaders, like the people on the webinar, to carve a modern engineering team and organization from within that established enterprise and to successfully attract the talent that you need. So let's start with a more general question before we focus on the specifics. And Steve, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay. When thinking about recruitment and talent management, what approaches and techniques can you recommend to help attract top talent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, at Slack is a little different. Obviously, we're definitely able to attract the talent here in Silicon Valley. But I do think actually the thing that's often underestimated, I think for enterprises actually, is impact. And I think like often when I speak to engineers, the teams that want to work on are the teams that are shipping. And in some ways, I think there's an over infatuation with like innovation and kind of like what's the innovative idea that the engineer is building. But I actually think one of the things actually, yes, getting to use latest tools and technologies, but actually shipping stuff. And I think that and actually having an impact on a large group of people is kind of like, I think most engineers dream really. So I think if you're in a larger enterprise, like, you hear, I mean, clearly like The Economist, BBC, those are like big impact organizations. Like the work you're doing goes out to a lot of people. They feel that impact. And I do think with the rise of IT and, they're seeing the importance in enterprise, like you're working with new projects, you get to you launch new products. So all that, I think that's a way to sort of lean into that side rather than it being like, hey, we're a technology business, come join us because we're all a bunch of nerds. It's like actually, we're a business that's launching lots of really cool things that are supported by technology. You're going to, be able to innovate and actually impact a large audience of people as a way to think about it. But I suppose the other piece that for me, I think one of the concerns that I hear often with engineers who are going into maybe non-engineering enterprises is mentorship and growth and kind of like that sense of path to being able to do something. You don't want to be seen as a secondary organization within a primary organization. I sort of felt that a little bit, Kennedy, when I was in the NHS. It was like IT was sort of, yeah, there's the IT people over there, but really we're all about healthcare. And I don't know where the healthcare industry has moved in the UK since, but like that kind of integration of like technology and health wasn't really felt at that time. So there weren't the mentorship programs, there weren't the growth programs. You're kind of a little bit of a secondary in the business. So hopefully that's change. But so I do think that's something to lean into, that like, hey, there's a program here for you to grow. We do understand this is a discipline in which you're going to get good at here. You're going to launch some cool things and actually grow your career as, as a path. So those are probably two thoughts I have on that subject.
Yeah, good one. Thank you. Dilip, I know you've worked across both large enterprises and tech startups. Are there approaches and techniques which work across both ends of that spectrum to attract the right people, do you think?
I'd probably say so, Rich, to be honest. So I think working across both, I'd say the main thing for people who we've recruited into the teams has been that they want to join a team where there's a clear vision and a team where you actually get things done. Essentially working with QA engineers, working with engineers also. People are just people and they just want to solve something that's interesting, something that they can actually get their skills into, and something where they can actually achieve something and make a difference. So that's the big thing for me. I think, like Steve said, career pathing is really, really key. So having a growth mindset and putting professional development at the heart of everything that people do. So if I use The Economist as an example, we have a very, very clear career progression plan. And essentially it means that people can grow and the company actually gets that benefit at the same time. But what's key in terms of people growing in both aspects is there needs to be psychological safety. People need to feel that they can try things out, they can experiment, they can make small mistakes, and they can still learn at the same time. So the way I see it in both aspects is it's a journey piece. It's an aspect where people can grow together, but I think the big thing really is having that interesting problem to actually solve.
Yeah, interesting that you've both touched on sort of impact and vision, but also the ability to ship stuff and make that impact in a sort of practical way. Blanca, I think you wanted to discuss specifically inclusivity in the recruitment process.
Yeah, totally. Because when you are a bigger enterprise, you have a lot more teams, and if you don't take a very conscious approach, you can just end up replicating, very kind of the same atmosphere at a smaller maybe enterprise who doesn't really have that power behind it. So one of the things that is key is to make sure that if you have interview panels, that they are diverse. Okay, you cannot improve what you don't measure. So measure the diversity of your teams and different angles, intersectional. Okay, it goes way beyond gender these days. Also, when you're interviewing, okay, don't look for people just having the skills like Dilip and Steve said. Actually, as an enterprise, you are offering a lot of training. So you're looking for different qualities in people. You're looking for that curiosity, for that alignment in the purpose with what your organization is aiming for, and just kind of show them also during that interview process what opportunities they have to learn. So people kind of see things beyond just almost like a delivery oriented role, okay, and see how they could kind of grow their career, and also showing your journey. So having diverse people on that panel can showcase people different journeys and paths that people have taken. It can be very inspirational for both sides. And also when you're measuring, the CVs that you get and how you're going to interview, use a strengths-based interviewing, not to just say no to people, but almost to address what gaps that then you can help them build from and grow from. And also, you can probably look beyond just having formal kind of titles, okay, university degrees from X places. There's lots of different talent pools, lots of groups, meetups, okay, and places you can go to and engage with people and just bring intentionally those people into your organization and make your organization closer to a lot of groups that potentially may not feel very close to a big enterprise.
Yeah, that's great points. And I loved your point about an inclusive panel being inspirational to a candidate. I hadn't thought about that before. That's a really good, really insightful point. Bree, can I turn to you, please? It can be challenging to attract, from a technology perspective, I think it can be challenging to attract top talent to work in companies that maybe aren't seen as cutting edge tech firms. Are there ways to combat that aspect?
It's an interesting one. So I think when you look at big organizations, it's not always a struggle to attract the talent. The talent's always out there in the market. I think the biggest challenge is actually retaining that talent and your attrition rate. That's usually what it ends up being. So you get that kind of almost reverse antibody effect of people coming in and rejecting the organization because it's not what they want or it's not what they used to. And I think both of our speakers before me have said, talked about motivations for being in an organization and the drive and the feeling of achievement. I kind of think about the psychological aspect of that. And for me, it's a lot like game theory. So a lot of engineers are wired for constant wins and that constant reaffirmment of success and that thing. And I like it too. I love working on something and having something actually go and pass and deploy, and it's all really great, and being able to move at a certain pace. And I think when you don't get those quick wins, and this is almost why Call of Duty is so popular, because you get those wins at every single match and you're guaranteed to get them even if you're a complete loser. Like a lot of organizations are not wired for this, and you're not getting that feedback and you're not getting that reaffirmment that you're looking for as an engineer. And often we're not very conscious of that, but that's one of those things that's deeply ingrained in us after years and years of working this way. And so it's quite hard. And I think really these organizations need to look at creating a sort of like a healthy landing zone. So that when you are creating an agile way of working, or if you are a regulated organization looking to move in a faster way, it's about admitting that it needs to be an organic sort of journey and looking at what that growth and what that journey needs to look like, and creating that safe zone for challenge and evolving the organization rather than sticking with your brittle ways of working that exist at the moment. And I think yeah, I mean mostly I would say that
Yeah.
I think yeah
good, thank you. One of the challenges that of a larger enterprise is often a background of legacy technology, which can require specialist skills and experience, which is hard to find, or people willing to work on a technology that's, let's say, far from the cutting edge. Dilip, do you have any ideas on how to sell that journey to a potential new joiner?
So what I say on this is, I think the key word that you put in that sentence is journey. And I think it needs to be a journey piece, but I think it needs to be broken down into specific elements. So the first one for me would be, what is the problem that you're looking to solve? Once you sell a problem to someone, essentially you should have them engaged, and there's more of a chance that somebody would want buy-in. So if I look at legacy tech, I would say things like, why do we want to move away from legacy tech? Is it because maintenance and support issues? Is it because of integration and compliance issues? Is it because we've had lost business opportunities? Or is it because it's our organizational ability to actually succeed in that market? So selling the problem first will mean that you have some buy-in. And then I think the big thing that I always say to people, start with the why. So why do we want to do this? Do we want to do this because of competitive advantage? Do we want happier clients or employees? And do we want a better performance culture so that we can continue to drive our improvement? And the last thing, and from a selfish perspective, and a candidate would have that, what is the benefit to that person? So what can they get out of this? If I was showcasing this to someone, it's that they could get more rounded skills. They could be part of a successful journey. And essentially, they could just pick up more skills than just working on the best tech. Essentially, you've gone through a journey piece. The tech isn't important. It's the journey that you've taken to get there.
Yeah, nice. And that ties back to what we've been saying previously about, starting with purpose, having a vision, having and the ability to just make things happen and make a difference. Blanca, I understand, back to Bree's point about retention, actually. Blanca, I understand you've had some experience in losing talent when working in legacy tech. What lessons did you learn to get through that challenge?
Well, it was a hard time. Okay, we lost most of a team that I was working in because we were on a legacy platform that it kept being postponed. That migration that Dilip was talking about. Sometimes, the organization, there's not a kind of a business case to migrate away, and you feel stuck with that system. And the BBC is 100 years old. Okay, we are not far from like legacy all over the place. How do you sell that to people? How do you get people motivated? So it's one of the things, it's about the purpose. Another thing, what is in it. In this specific example, I stayed because I think it was the first time in my career that I kind of saw and identified it was a very hard problem to solve, and it went beyond engineering. And there were a couple of the engineers in the team that actually stayed, and I remember we just talked about what could we learn from the system before the opportunity to migrate came about. Because even though it kept being postponed, we almost saw the kind of belief that was going to happen. And we thought, if we get a chance to build this system again, we don't want to make the same mistakes. So actually getting the chance to work on a complex system allows you to learn about the very, very complex problems and also understand what is the problem that you're trying to fix. And for that to work, we had to have support from senior management. Okay, this system was failing every other day of the week. Failures took days, sometimes weeks to actually debug. Okay, it was really hard, and they were really bad days. Okay, just being honest, and having that safety with the closer team and just that kind of psychological support from your peers that you are not a failure, even though everyone else around you knows that this system's failing, and they're almost like pointing fingers and be like, oh, you're working on a system that is failing, but you're kind of convinced that what you're working on is meaningful, is making an impact, and also you're going to help in the future. Your life is not going to end at the end of that project because what you learned is going to help the future projects. I think that's what was very, very key. And then at the end, our team ended up merging with a bigger team. And I ended up being almost in a kind of like a technical leadership position, just trying to frame people the problems. If this happened, and the problem is this, because I understood it so well at that point, I didn't need to invest so much in kind of the building, but almost getting the engineers to think about things that otherwise we would have perhaps missed.
And it sounds like as a team, you really then found the positives in what the situation you were in, and from a growth perspective and lessons learned and so on, and shared that.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Before I ask the next question, can I remind those of you watching to please submit any questions you've got in the Q&A. We'll do our best to get to them soon. So please do keep the moderators busy and get those questions in, and we'll do our best to get to them. So we talked a little bit about recruitment and retention and talent management in and around sort of enterprises and legacy technology and so on. I want to move on to a culture, because we touched on that. We've touched around the edges of that, but making sure we have the right environment to succeed once the team is established, I think sounds like it's critical from what we've been saying and from my experience as well. Steve, I think you wanted to talk about the importance of a product focus.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the culture side is interesting. I have to say, coming from the startup side, the culture has always been quite different. There's a sort of camaraderie that occurs when you're just fighting to build something from scratch and you're up against it. And then there's certainly, and I think in the larger organizations, I've seen kind of, certainly when I was at my prior employer, you can see things where there's like product focus doesn't mean that product managers are taking the lead of everything and that they're making all the decisions. And I've seen these kind of unhealthy environments where sort of engineering falls back into a position of I do it because the product manager says. And then also situations where when things get released and they feel that like, hey, finally got something shipped and out the door. If an issue occurs, then they get the backlash from the organization of like, okay, you've shipped a bug, and that kind of how those situations are managed. That kind of whole dynamic was really interesting for me in the multiple companies I've worked at, just to see. You don't want engineers to start building a fear that when they ship, what happens next is they get shouted at because they didn't get everything right. And equally, you don't want to have engineering retreat into being the people who are just typing the words and typing the code. And a lot of, we did simple things actually. When I joined Slack, Rukmini, who actually runs, who's my engineering counterpart, she is way better at building engineering culture than I am. And actually, I've learned a lot from her. But we just did simple things. We actually just said, hey, like the product team, the lead of the product person, the lead engineering manager should have a daily sync just for 15 minutes every day and just talk. And it may seem like, why would that even help? But actually, it was amazing how much it gelled the teams and kind of started to bring in that shared sense of ownership. So when we talk about like a product focus, it's not like the product managers are dictating it. It's actually, we have product engineering and design leaders meeting very, very regularly to actually devise what the vision is collectively. So we're not setting up that tug of war that you typically hear about, which is like, hey, product person just wants to ship more product and doesn't care about like quality, and if you're like, taking the vitamins or eating the vegetables with the stuff that we're shipping, like, refactoring code, thinking about performance improvements, thinking about engineering agility improvements, thinking about deprecations and stuff like that. We've kind of moved away from that model to one of like, hey, we understand we're all trying to get a product shipped. We're speaking regularly. We're kind of removing that culture of, who, very specifically who does what, to a much more shared ownership of product. And that's had a really tremendously positive impact on the organization. The work that we've been doing at Slack, the engineering team that I'm on and lead with Rukmini and Heather on the design side, the performance backs up, and we're one of the top performing teams within Slack itself. And that's just because we've just kept that open communication. I've just seen that fail so many times that the people just sort of retreat into their separate teams. And it's such a failure of culture, I think.
Yeah, and I think often, and again, this is a generalization, but often enterprises can have quite traditional, let's say, silos or hierarchies or whatever that maybe reinforce some of those barriers that sometimes exist. Bree, I know you see culture as an important aspect of building high-performing teams. Are there specific ideas or areas of focus for you, maybe when setting up a team, in creating the right cultural environment?
Yeah, definitely. Approaching this from like a regulated sort of view and being in those environments, one of the really good ones to get out of the way is a lot of folks will come in with a very permissive mindset of what they can and can't do, and they've, again, like in lots of their environments, been shaped into working into certain ways. I think if you want to create agility, you need to look at what like distributed decision making looks like in your team, for example, where people can make those decisions in the field, or where something falls into something that is maybe a strategic kind of decision, where you're choosing software or something like that, and that would fall into strategic bucket. And so you might want to go and say, well, that's something that needs to come back up the hierarchy. And it's one of those things you kind of can't get away with. I love flat teams, but you can never get away from accountable and responsible. And I think if you can set that up very early, then you can start looking at that distributed decision-making framework and give people the freedom to operate within that in a sort of safe way. I'm also a really big believer in teams deciding their own way of operating. So if you can go and decide those interlocks early on, so when you're going to come together and start showcasing the stuff that you've worked on, when that's a big deal, when the business needs to come down and start looking at the stuff that you've done, then folks should be free to go and either adopt like a common model that you know works, or go and establish their own if they want to go and do something different, as long as those results are there. And again, you're able to get, as a leader, I think, give them the room to calibrate and figure out whether something they want to go and do works. And I think it also reinforces, I think, what you get out of it. So if you can write up why you failed, if that didn't work out so well, it contributes to that culture of actually it's okay to go and do these experiments that sometimes really don't work out. And here's a living history somewhere in Git where these are all the experiments we tried, and it gives people that, again, when you're coming in early in that permissive thing, saying, here's this repository, like go and look at our postmortems on day one, go and look at all the experiments we've ran, and it sort of reinforces like this is actually your way of working. It's not made up and some secret boogeyman's going to come and get you at some point. Buying into things is quite important. So one of the first things I did nationwide when I built the digital platform was to have an artist come in. They sent everyone to the pub and said, like, come up with your team names, and we're going to do logos for you, and we'll get these big signs put above your desks and stuff, and everyone go and like decide on what your values are as a squad and what that's going to be. And so they all got their values. And the best name that never got chosen, or the two, Back to the Feature and the Kubernators. I don't know why they never got chose, but they never got chose. I thought they were really good. And Steve touched on this, and I think this is really important, co-creation of the backlog. So as engineers, I think, there is always an emotional investment in your work. And I like to liken this a little bit to like the 3 lines of risk defense. So if we are operational risk and we are the people doing the work, you can erode that line of defense. And I think when you have that setup where you have product coming on really strong and sort of like really ogering over the backlog and taking massive control over it, and as an engineer, you're trying to fight for that little bit of technical debt, 2 weeks later you realize you could have done it a little bit better, there's something lurking out there that you want to come back to. Or even just, I know you've got this sense of like correctness, like when you think there's a correct way to do this, like and maybe there's not a lot of value in that, but there's emotional value. And I think this is the thing that always gets forgotten, is that you start to erode that emotional investment in what you've got. It's quite hard to bring it back as well once you've done that. So you have to give a little bit. And I think co-creating that backlog with features versus that technical debt versus like there's little bits of correctness and there's little bits of thing that help people buy in, really important to keep the momentum going. And I think, again, in regulated environments, you have this tapestry, really rich tapestry of controls and regulation, and it's always wrapped in this control framework. And I think, one, you've got to have this really strong sense of what first line operational risk looks like. So your engineers absolutely must understand the environment they work in. They must be able to identify the risk. You can't apply the controls if you can't identify risk. So if you've got no engineers that actually can identify it, you're probably in really big trouble for that model actually working. So getting that education and getting that uplift in early is quite important, because I've worked in lots of places where really they've been devoid of sort of any sort of defense on first line. And it's quite interesting to see people throw these controls later on in the program, and you're like, bam, here's 134 controls that you didn't make, and your engineers have got no idea what to do, never seen them before, and there's been no engagement. And also challenging them. So again, when I'm doing this stuff where it's relatively new and it is regulated and you've got a lot of no people, how do you create that healthy challenge environment where you can go back and say, actually you don't want to do deep packet inspection, that's really ancient and you're never going to get that done in AWS, you probably want to do end-to-end encryption or something like that. So just going back and reframing it with folks, and I think setting that up early where it is a healthy challenge and you can go back in that org and say, actually something else makes sense, really important to retain that talent, because if you get too many no's, people will just leave anyway and your attrition rate goes up. And then that really underlying fact that should be there, which is like, this is like a journey, and it is something that should be organic. And it's really easy for an organization to go off the shelf to the big four or one of those consultancy companies, say, I want to buy this model. We all know the one that everyone does, and this is what you're going to do, prescribe it. And I think, setting that up really early, it's like, we don't know what works because we don't know where you are in your maturity as an organization. There's all this stuff around the outside that is operating the way that they are. We need to find a way that works with them. So I think I always make sure, and I've fallen foul of this a few times, that I come in at the right level so that I can operate with that mindset. And I will never make the mistake of coming in at the wrong level and not being able to operate with that mindset again.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about healthy challenge, and when you can identify the opportunities to do that, I think it can be very powerful. You went and you've got to grab those, because it allows you to go to those no people, as you mentioned, and show that you're trying to solve their problem and you're trying to solve it in a different way, but by showing you understand and you empathize with their problem or their challenge, you're proving you're not the cowboys in the corner. You're actually able to demonstrate that you're on their side. We've got a shared purpose, shared problem, but there's a different way of solving it.
Well, this is it. Controls often are like I call them a really rich tapestry that has evolved over time. And quite a lot of the time you lose the heritage. And it's very hard to figure out why a particular control was formed and what caused it to get formed. What was the original risk that it originated from? And people lose it. And so they run around and they just go, this is the control, you have to do it. And they don't really know why they need to do it anymore. They just know it exists and you have to go and tick that box. And so I find that actually there's very few people that are willing to go out there, for example, and read the EBA guidance on cloud outsourcing, for example, and actually understand why that document says what it says, how it says, and what you need to go and do. Do you need to do multi-cloud? Not really, not even if you're a CMA9 bank. But you have to read the regulation to understand that. And so few people are willing to do that. And I think if you do that and you do end up speaking to the right stakeholders, there's a lot of credibility and a lot of respect you can earn by just doing the basic reading, come to these folks in their domain and say, I'm not the expert, but can we do a little bit of healthy challenge and trade on this?
Yeah. Be best friends with the person you see as a no person, I think is the lesson there.
Bring them in. Everyone loves a cuddle.
Exactly. Speaking of integrating with colleagues, Blanca, from your experience, what are some ways to help with that connection, to help engineering teams and individuals integrate with colleagues in the wider enterprise?
There's the obvious onboarding process when you join a team, but in a large enterprise, that goes way beyond the immediate team that you're working with. So in maybe your first month or your first few months, you're going to be focused on your immediate team and just getting to grips with the tech stack, okay, and the different people in the team and your manager and setting goals. But then over time, I think for me to be effective in a wide organization, I had to understand, what is the organization's aim, priorities, what are the different business areas that are in the organization. So you begin almost like wondering, how do you begin breaking down the barriers between engineering teams, not just even like engineering and product, like Steve mentioned, but also engineering with the rest of the organization and kind of understanding what are the problems and how can engineering teams actually solve those problems. And there's sometimes a fear with engineers to get very close to your users, your audience, your stakeholders, because you might hear things that you don't want to hear. So I think one of the things is to invest in kind of getting those relationships going so you can have those conversations more easily. And some of the things that large enterprises offer are employee resource networks. Okay, one example is at the BBC, we have a Women in STEM network. So it's women working in science, technology, engineering, and maths roles. And the reason why it's kind of so broad is because in the BBC, we're a large media organization. In this group, I have met women working in finance roles, for example, which I would have never perhaps on my day-to-day struck a conversation with, okay? Women working in editorial teams who happen to do a lot of maybe data work, but their role is not maybe kind of engineering per se. So those networks over time, they have given me a huge amount of support, a lot of understanding about what are the problems in the different areas, about where my team sits and the impact that I can have. And also it's given me support in times that perhaps I've had a problem and I needed someone to confide in, but being a team problem, I didn't want to perhaps kind of share it with the team immediately. So it's been a sounding board. And I've also gained a mentor, a woman who's, in her early 60s, and I just never met, a woman, an older woman having had a career in technology who was such an inspiration to me. And I think it's that perspective and gaining almost like the space to see where are you in the organization, what opportunities are there, and what things can your team bring in is hugely empowering. Okay, so it brings me a lot of motivation, which in turn I try to get my team to also their other employee resource networks. Okay, it's not just the women in STEM. And in engineering teams, you could look at, for example, guilds. Okay, so groups of people informally organized to address specific problems. Okay, so that every team doesn't end up solving the same problem in a different way. One of these teams can tackle continuous integration, okay, at a scale. Another team can talk performance at scale, which we have a lot of kind of performance and kind of event-driven performance requirements in the BBC. So those are some examples. And I think it's, when you join a big organization, you don't really know unless someone has told you. Okay, so you almost need a bit of like that onboarding into all of the available tool set. And for me, because before the BBC, I was in smaller companies, I would just kind of strike up a conversation, or you would end up, one day at the pub or having a company lunch, and you would just talk to anyone. So that happened very easily. And when I joined the BBC, I was just really conscious that I was missing those interactions, and I just didn't really know how to go. So that's why I mention it, because I think it's something that is not tapped enough, and it can provide people a lot of support on the journey, a lot of career opportunities as well.
Yeah, I really like the point about sometimes you don't know unless someone tells you, and that goes back to what Bree was saying about distributed decision making and knowing what you're allowed on day one, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, and actually, making sure that through that onboarding process or through team norms or whatever it might be, that we're making sure people know, just know stuff about the enterprise, because it's a big place, because it's got rules and hierarchy and oral tradition and this, that, and the other. Just making sure people know and have some way of finding out. Steve, one last question for you. There are some cultural aspects which are often highlighted as vital for success of engineering teams. We've touched on a couple of them today. Things like psychological safety has been mentioned, empowerment and decision making and so on. Do you think, in your experience, that those factors are any different in a larger organization, or if they're harder to establish or easier to establish?
It's a good question. I mean, I was interested in Blanca's story about, that kind of legacy tech and having to sell the value of innovation. I suppose when you work for a technology business, you don't have to sell the value of it. It's how the business makes its money. So that's kind of an easy sell. But I do think, like, and Philippe, I thought your framework was great around thinking about like how you sell and think about this sort of engineering culture. But I do think for larger organizations and, retaining talent, that ability to kind of sell innovation and sort of lead innovation within a large enterprise is kind of critical, I think, to how it kind of sets the cultural benchmark that, that innovation is a core part of the business as opposed to just a nice to have. But I was saying about a few things like culture, like psychological safety is easy to talk about, and it's easy to say, hey, we should like fail fast and failure is okay. But actually, a lot of what I've seen is actually where that often falls down is the tenor of how like emergencies are managed. And when things go wrong, that's usually when you see the destruction of psychological safety, where people see actually culturally how that works. And I've too often seen that people then focus on the team or the people and not on the process and how we can actually improve it for next time. And I think that not getting that right can really affect the psychological safety of the teams and culturally affect how people embark on work and on innovation, because nobody wants to get a phone call in the middle of the night that their code was the reason why the whole system fell over, and certainly don't want to be held up as the person who did that. It should be a process issue, not a people person thing. But it was kind of interesting, again, like Blanca, what you talking about, like this of team structure and team dynamic. I think one of the things I've often sort of seen is like when we think about that, again, the safety, but also just how teams work, is there is often a nature where when say a new interesting project comes out, the natural instinct for most leaders is to pick the obvious favorites and top performers because they know that they can get it done, and they very quickly see that. And I think really every leader should take pause, and just kind of saying like, hey, like, let's give this a little broader, cast the net a little more broadly. Let's not just lean immediately into our, most obvious top performers. Because I do think, just like with that interview panel that you talked about, Blank, of like showing diversity, that also which teams are leading top projects signals how the organization thinks about career and career growth. And I think, again, that affects how people approach their work. So I don't think that that's specific to enterprise versus software business. We do, have the habit of doing the same thing. We have to stop ourselves all the time. It's like, yes, I know that the obvious choice would be these 3 people, but we're actually going to just try out, give a new talent an opportunity to show themselves. And then I suppose the last thing I think, which I think is across the board, whether you're a software business like Slack or the BBC or whatever, but it's just being like super clear on goals for engineers and sort of how they think about the safety of what they can do. So for example, we're running an alpha of some work that we're doing in Slack and platform, which you'll hear more about later in the year, but is, it was very interesting to see how we talked about the goals of each phase, like through this alpha, then going into beta, has really affected how the engineering team are approaching the work and how they're sensing that feeling of success. And initially we weren't as clear on what the goals would be, because actually, candidly, it was so new, we didn't really know how to measure. There was so much exploration and innovation going on. It was kind of hard to work out exactly. So, but we noticed we let it go too long without actually setting those achievement targets of like what success looks like at this phase. And I think often people look at what success looks like at the end, but they don't look at what the success looks like as we get there. And that can really impact how people approach things. So we for example, we had to just say to engineering, like, your goal right now is not quality. Your goal right now is discovery and innovation. So stop acting like the goal is quality and production, because that's actually not what success looks like at this stage. So just things like that. Anyways, I don't think those are unique to enterprise or businesses that specialize in software, but anyway, just some reflections.
Yeah, no, really good. I can really relate to the thing you were saying about choosing specific individuals for specific teams based on specific things, and it reminds me of Brent in the Phoenix Project. I'm sure some people will have read that, but you end up with that one person without whom the organization kind of falls down, or the technology stack falls down, and that's entirely unhelpful to anybody. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, and I think we're probably not going to get to any of the questions from the Q&A. So what I'd like to do is remind everybody at this point to please do come along to the Slack channel after the call. If you have questions that we haven't got to, we'll do our best to answer them in that Slack channel, in that Slack conversation after the call. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody for all the great insights in the panel. I've picked up my table's full of Post-it notes. I've picked up so much from listening to you all, and I hope the people watching have got some good ideas. Even though we've all come from different backgrounds and companies, different industries, it sounds like we're pretty aligned on the importance of sort of vision and purpose, and having that as a sort of common thread to recruit and then retain people, even if maybe they're working on different technologies or in having different legacy challenges or whatever. As long as you've got that clarity of purpose, that's a real help. Shipping stuff and making a difference, just being able to make a change and see that thing realized. But to Steve's point at the end there, it's not necessarily just about delivering the end state in the production environment. That might be an interim phase. It might be just getting to an alpha, getting to just an improvement in the CI pipeline, or whatever it might be. Just seeing that idea, that purpose come to life. We talked quite a bit about career path and professional development as well, and making sure that we've got the ability to show career development, and the networks and the discussion and the ability to sort of engage with human beings and interact as an important part of development and retention and holding on to people. There was also a common thread that I pulled out a couple of times about, someone used the word camaraderie, that you get from sometimes a difficult situation that might be, I mean, I can remember some of my closest friends that I still have from the AOL days were the people that I was still there with at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning, and that was a particularly tough time. But you have a shared challenge, you have a shared problem, that a shared sort of crisis that you're dealing with, and that can really create tight bonds and retention. So it's not just, and you can get those in software companies as just as much as you can get them in a larger enterprise. So lots of really good conversation, and again, thank you very much for your experience and expertise and telling those stories. Before we close the webinar, I'd like to say a big thank you to Lead Dev and Slack for partnering to create the webinar. And obviously, again, just a big thank you to everyone on the panel for sharing your time and experience, and everybody watching from home. I hope you're all staying safe and well. Challenging times for us all, and I know, but hugely appreciate the community coming together. And I look forward to speaking to you all. We'll all be heading over to the Lead Dev Slack in the Creating Culture channel. Please head over there to continue the discussion. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you next time.